Hi, my name is Michael Chikeen. The smartest people I've met have one common belief, that us silly humans really don't know much. For example, we still don't know why planes stay in the air, or how Tylenol or even gravity works. Yeah, gravity. Look it up. In today's distracted, clickbait, misinformation age, I wish we could all be less certain, more humble, and a lot more curious. Admittedly, I've been known to struggle with all three. So no more, no less, this show is my attempt to be that change. Thanks for joining me, and here we go. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the show. I'm still your host, Michael Chikeen, and here in the studio today, I have with me Dr. Brad Kelln. Brad is a clinical forensic psychologist, has worked in the area of sexual offenders for over 20 years. He works full-time at Atlantic Canada's largest forensic psychiatric facility, consults for the RCMP, and maintains a busy private practice. In 2020, he expanded his evolutionary approach from male sexuality to general mental health and wrote a book called Hacking Evolution, Ditch Anxiety, Get Happy Forever, which I read recently and I'm excited to chat about today. So let's dive in. Dr. Brad Kelln, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Michael. Glad to be here.
Firstly, I just want to start with kind of the basics. So maybe you can tell us what exactly a forensic psychologist or a psychiatrist is and how that might differ from other types of psychiatrists.
So I'm a psychologist. Psychiatry does their degree in medicine and then they specialize in mental health.
Okay.
As a psychologist, I did all of my university right through graduate school and my PhD in mental health. And within the field of psychology, when you work with people, generally you do a clinical PhD, which is what I did. And then you have the opportunity to specialize. So there can be child psychologists or geriatric psychologists, et cetera. As a forensic psychologist, I work in the intersection between the criminal justice system and mental health. So if you see someone on the news that's committed a crime and they're sent for a mental health evaluation, or someone has been found in Canada, it's called not criminally responsible. So that means that there's been extenuating circumstances around their offending related to their mental health condition that affects their criminal responsibility. So they should be treated as a patient rather than an offender. Okay. Those are the kind of worlds I work in.
Okay. And when did you decide that you wanted to kind of branch out into something outside of that? Because I'm sure that entire world could be another hour that we could talk about.
Well, so clinical psychology is really interesting that it offers so many different pathways for how you can use those skills, from working private practice to being a consultant, to working within hospital systems. And then within every one of those systems, there's specialized populations. So I always had an interest in being an author in addition to my work as a psychologist. So I was sort of drawn to an area that offered some more of that material, if you will, for putting into books. And I also had an interest in law. In my early days in university, I thought I might actually go the route of a criminal lawyer. Okay. So it kind of was a natural pathway for me to end up in forensic clinical psychology. And within that area, even there's specializations. And within the Maritimes here where I work, there has been quite a need because of a lack of professionals within the area for work around people with sexual issues, particularly those that cross over into offending. And so my pathway sort of started in general forensic psychology and then branched to become more specialized, especially within my private practice, into the sex offender world.
Okay, that's interesting. And do you think there's more demand for people to be working in that field because there is such a stigma around it? I remember years ago I read an article, I believe it was in the New York Times, about pedophiles and sexual offenders and how there's a real issue because obviously it's so stigmatized because what they do when they offend is so horrific, but also that some of them just have this I guess, mental predisposition for desire to do these things, and they feel afflicted as well. And so I think the article was kind of saying, like, if we can identify and try to help these people, then we're going to have less offenses. But as we identify them, they're immediately vilified. So then there's less incentive for them to allow themselves to be identified. Like, I don't know if I'm remembering that correctly, but...
Well, you are, and it's a giant problem. I mean, that's one of the things that kind of interests me about that field is that, you know, the public outcry for anyone even accused of a sexual offense is so dramatic, like string them up, hang them,
Right.
that kind of thing, that you actually drive these people into hiding and make it more likely that they're going to offend. So from the front end, people that have those predilections towards that aren't going to come out and seek help because they don't want to be vilified. And from the back end of things, after you're treated, where do you end up living? Because the media is happy to post that a sex offender's moved into a neighborhood or something like that. And so it makes it very difficult for them to maintain normal vocational and social relationships.
Right. And I imagine the more you separate them from society, the more isolation kicks in, and the more they will maybe, go on dark web sort of chat groups where the only place where they can find camaraderie. Is that accurate?
That's accurate, because in the last 20 years, there's been a movement within the treatment of people with sexual offenses towards something called the good lives model. And that's recognizing that to treat someone effectively, you don't just treat the actual risk stuff, you actually need to create for them a better lifestyle. So that includes better social relationships, more things connecting them to their society and to their world. And when they get that label, sometimes that's hard to do. But that's a more effective treatment approach than to, for example, punish someone for their sexual interests.
Right. That's super interesting. I don't want to belabor the point, because that whole area is fascinating as well. But I want to get into your pivoting about evolution and the human brain. A good portion of the book is focused on our evolution as a species. And as someone who loved the book *Sapiens*, that I read a couple times, and have you read it from?
I haven't. I've come across it a couple times. It's on my list. Sorry.
Okay. It's essentially much of the things that you're talking about in the book is essentially of how we evolved, why life itself isn't precious. We just happen to exist. And that's why we're here. And I was hoping, the one thing that I think I found quick in the book was the parallel between, and I kind of joke about this, about the parallel between more human conveniences and emotional suffering. And I was speaking to someone the other day about like a climate related topic. And I was saying, like, I bet the graph for the amount of conveniences we have in our life is kind of parallel to the extinction of our species. Like, the more conveniences we get, we're just kind of blowing through everything that we have here. And I'd love to see how you link it to anxiety and things like that. I'd love to hear you maybe tell some of the audience about that.
So that's a central sort of tenet of the book, is that evolution worked. It created us a species, humans, that can survive when they shouldn't have. But they survived under very specific circumstances. Our evolution was under very specific environmental circumstances, that being, the wilderness and being under constant threat for that survival, and being one of the weakest animals in the animal kingdom. Like, those are the conditions under which we evolved. So the advantage we had was basically one thing, which is our brain. And that's what, like, one of the first myths I like to dispel for people that aren't familiar with the area is that your brain isn't special. Like, your brain evolved in the same way that you have a thumb. Like, we don't sit and marvel at our thumbs and think, oh my God, what a gift from God that we have these thumbs. I mean, some people might, but generally I don't have long conversations. Mostly. Yeah. But I mean, in the same way that our thumbs are really, were an evolutionary adaptation to allow us to manipulate our environment in a much more detailed way, our brains evolved to provide different advantages, right? But they evolved under very specific circumstances that no longer exist for many of us. And that's what you're getting at there, I think, about life got easy. We have the conveniences and so on. So, I mean, a question I often ask when I'm working with someone in private practice or in mental health in general is, how often do you feel your survival is threatened in the run of a day? Like, I mean, not that you just feel worried someone cut you off in traffic, but how often do you think it's a life or death situation that you're facing right then and there? Not very often, because society and the various things that happened along the way changed how difficult it is to stay alive. And that was the fundamental rule that shaped evolution for all species for millions and millions of years, is what do we need to do to stay alive? Not to thrive, not to, be content and relaxed and happy, because that's another big piece of the book, is that happiness is not involved in evolution. And we can get into that a bit later. But so in terms of the anxiety question, if you consider that our ancestors, 100,000, 200,000 years ago, at which point this biology was set. So that's another important thing to remember, is that, the way we think and operate and feel and experience our world was the same way, more or less, that our ancestors 100,000 years experienced and felt and looked at the world. But in those times, 100,000 years ago, everything was a threat. So you were constantly forced to be fully present in the now, observing your surroundings, being aware of other predators, being aware of environmental conditions. Like if the sky is darkening, knowing that I better find some shelter because, I could get super cold or die. Knowing that if I'm starting to get hungry and I don't have a ready source of food, that needs to become the number one priority, that I have to race around finding food. Right. So our ancestors spent, let's say 95% of their waking hours in this state of being fully present, aware of their surroundings, and engaged in their surroundings to survive. Okay. That other little 5% period for our ancestors was using that brain to imagine what might come up 6 months from now, and what went wrong with the hunt, a couple of weeks ago, where half the tribe got killed when we tried to take down that saber-toothed tiger. So it's in that 5% of the time that our brains really went into overdrive to try and problem solve and come up with solutions to things and really aid with our survival. Okay. And I say that because it flipped with the conveniences that you're talking about. That percentage flipped, so that now we spend, and it's generous, but 5% of the time in this survival in the now fully present period, and 95% of the time in this state of living in our heads and thinking about what could go wrong, and worried about stuff that's happened in the past, and contemplating all sorts of catastrophe for the future. And that's where the anxiety comes from. In my book, I talk about how it's a well-known fact that in less advanced parts of the world, where there's still, either civil war, or there's scarcity of resources, or there's other sorts of things, anxiety disorders are very rare, because those people deal with real world problems. Right. And they put those problems that they have to look for and put to work solutions around those problems. So it actually completes the cycle of what evolution intended, is to worry about something and do something about it. Worry about something. Where am I going to find food? Do something about it. Worry about hearing a predator in the woods nearby. Get away. So I've done something about it. It completes this cycle. But nowadays, with comforts and conveniences, we worry about stuff, but there's just nothing to do about it. So we just end up living with it. That's what creates, anxiety is not, this is another important factor that people seem to not be aware of, is that anxiety is fine. Anxiety is good. Like if you're walking down the road and there's a stranger walking behind you, and they're kind of keeping pace with you, and they're turning every corner with you, and there's pretty suspicious what's going on with this stranger, you should be anxious, right? You should be thinking, should I get out of here? Should I? Right.
It's a signal. It's
a signal. Right. But in that case, right, you'd be anxious, and there'd be an action, you would do something about it, right? But for most of the rest of the time, we get worried about things, and there's nothing we can do about it.
Right.
And that's what becomes the disorder.
Yeah, I really like how that's framed, because I think we can even draw a line between physical and emotional anxiety, or let me phrase it differently. So, like you said, when we're hunter-gatherers, it's dark, there's a storm coming, there's a tiger on my tail, then it's more like a physical threat to our environment. And there's not really time for the higher level feelings, because back however many thousand years ago, I don't think we even registered that we had feelings. It was all action and consequence and so forth. Whereas now it seems like we're aware that we have feelings, and there's so many other ways for us to layer on what status means to us in our brain for how we are in life.
Actually, I would reframe that slightly.
Sure.
Because I think it's a really important distinction. So what you're talking about, So what I believe was the evolutionary origin of emotion is that it's one thing to recognize a danger or a problem or something that's a survival threat. It's another thing to have an urgency of action for that. Right?
Okay.
So if I hear a rustle in the bushes nearby, my ancestors do, they hear a rustle in the bushes nearby. I mean, that could be a friendly neighbor, or it could be a predator, or it could be, a small animal that could be food.
Okay.
But so the brain might be processing all these different things. And that means it's inaction, right? So I'm contemplating, what could that be? Maybe I'll wait and find out. From an evolutionary perspective, where survival is the number one thing, in those moments of uncertainty, it makes way more sense that you would immediately become anxious, thinking this is a threat to me, to my survival. That welling of negative energy or emotion creates an urgency of action to get the hell out of there.
Okay.
So if you imagine, like this is a mental exercise I do all the time. If you had two different ancestors, and one ancestor is like really contemplative and thinking, I wonder what that could be in the bushes. And the other one's like, oh, fuck, I'm getting out of here right now. The one that got out of there survives. The one that doesn't, most of the time, is not, because of over multiple encounters with a rustling in the bushes. One of those times is going to be a predator that's going to take you out. Okay. So emotions get paired with situations to create this urgency of action, so that there's this immediate welling of high level negative energy, so that the organism, the person, will act and do something that's in their best interest from a survival point of mind. Now, the important thing, and why this distinction is so important, is because I say over and over again that mental health and people in general trust emotions too much. Your emotions are not a good guide to reality. And yet so much in mental health, like there's a lot of things in mental health that I'm very upset with, because I feel like we're misleading people. But that's one of the big ones, is to trust your gut, trust your emotions, talk about your emotions, et cetera, et cetera. Because, I mean, have you ever heard the adage to sleep on it or to count to 10? Like those are things that were this recognition, this kind of old school recognition that the in the moment emotional experience oftentimes is overblown.
Right.
Because it's overblown from evolution, because it needs to be to get you to survive. But these days, when we have these overblown emotions and we have this other notion that we should trust it, then we act very much not in our best interest.
Right. Isn't there maybe some gray area in there in which we hear, again, maybe differentiate between the signal and the noise, where like you feel something, and sometimes, yeah, that is a signal that you should listen to, because perhaps a person you're near or an environment you're in, there's something off and there's something in your gut that you should listen to. But then other times, let's say like you're super anxious about getting on stage and giving a speech and you're almost terrified. Like there is no clear and present danger there. You're just scared of being judged by your peer group, and this isn't something that we need to really listen to. Is that a fair distinction?
Yeah, right. The first thing you're talking about, that intuition, that's actually a cognitive process and not an emotional process. Like there's a lot of research going into that. There's something, for example, called micro expressions. Have you ever come across that?
Sure.
Yeah. So we're learning more and more that we pick up on things at a deep cognitive level that we're not even aware of. So if you meet somebody and you have a reaction to them and you think this person's bad news, you might be kind of framing it as an emotional, but what actually happened is that you process at a cognitive level that, for example, the person's verbal presentation doesn't match their facial presentation. Like that's a big one for people. If a person's,
right,
you think, well, there's something wrong. This guy's trying to get something from me, or they're trying to, deceive me somehow. Mm-hmm. But you have a bad feeling about that, but its origins are from this cognitive processing that we're not aware of. The stage example is a good one, because your in the moment reaction to that scenario is at such a heightened level that sometimes people do have those panic reactions. They're not even able to go on stage, because from an evolutionary perspective, you're experiencing that at the level of a survival threat. Like, I need to get out of here. Right. And that's why we need to start changing that, the how much we trust that emotion, and maybe figuring out ways to reduce that in the moment emotional sensation or experience, because they are misleading to us about what actually is is important.
That's great, because I really do think there's a lot of space in the general media about this gray area, whereas there, like, some people will say, fuck your feelings. Other people will say, only listen to your feelings. And I think what you're saying is, and the reason why I really like the book is that, like, there is a middle ground here where, like, some feelings, yes, they are very important because maybe they come from intuition, but I would say we experience intuition as a feeling, but then other ones we can kind of sit with ourselves and say, like, oh no, this is just an alarm bell that maybe I should learn to quiet. And I really wish more people were giving that message, because you go on at one point to talk about distraction in social media and something that, like, I really work to struggle with. Whereas, like, if we're having a feeling of despair or misery or other things, it's easy for us to distract ourselves with social media. And I've spoken with other friends as well that maybe they're in a relationship that isn't going so great, but they just end up spending more time on Facebook or on Instagram or whatever. And so a relationship that maybe should last 6 months ends up lasting 2 or 3 years. So I was hoping you could talk to a little bit about this kind of a distraction society that we're living through.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of where I'm at now in terms of my thinking about mental health came from a place of trying to understand the incredibly destructive relationship that males have with internet pornography, and the cavalier attitude that most people in the general public and a lot of mental health people have about porn. I mean, you even hear sex counselors and marriage counselors talk about how porn might be something they could use as a part of understanding themselves, et cetera, et cetera. But that falls within the same domain. So when I started expanding my model to understanding mental health in general, one of the things that was really clear to me is how the internet, social media, is a distraction that actually plays on basic evolutionary needs that a person has. So there's 4 essential components of wellness that evolution created as we developed. The first is this need for social connectedness, like feeling like you are a member of a tribe, essentially, because that was hugely important for our survival. The other is intimacy in relationships and sexuality, that evolution is because of survival, but that means nothing if there isn't procreation. Obviously, you can be the absolute best person at surviving, hunting, and escaping predators and stuff, but if you don't pass that on genetically to the next generation, then it's done. So evolution is equal parts survival and procreation. And so that sexuality piece and relationship and intimacy piece too, and there's reasons for that I could get into, why intimacy becomes a factor there, but that's important. Learning and novelty and creativity and exploration, also hugely important from an evolutionary perspective. Like you couldn't have survived in the wilderness without having this natural inclination towards what's behind that hill, like finding a better cave, finding a new food source. Like that kind of exploration is super important. And related to that is being busy and active. That our ancestors, there's this urge to be doing something. Like in the book, I talk about affective forecasting. So there's this whole line of research in psychology that looks at how well can we guess how particular activities will change our mood. And we're terrible at it. So if you ask a person, like, what do you want to do this weekend? What would make you happy this weekend? The person, oftentimes people will say, I just want to lie around. It's been a busy week. I just want to sit on the couch. I just want to veg. I want to do nothing. That will not make you happy. In fact, that will agitate most people, because after 5 minutes of relaxing on the couch, you're like, I should do something. Right. Because you evolve to be a do something species. So I say there's those 4 things. There's the social, there's the intimacy and sexuality, there's the creativity, learning and exploration, and there's being busy. Unfortunately, the social media people and the internet in general gives us the impression of doing just that when we go online. It feels like it's social. Like if we log into our Facebook account, it feels like we're being busy. It feels like we're learning stuff. Like when you flip mindlessly through TikTok and there's an interesting recipe. Like it tricks us into thinking that we're being active, that we're being social, that we're, and it actually, it messes with us at a neurochemical level. And that's why we can escape into that world for, some people for hours and hours on end, but you come away from it feeling completely hollow. There's just no lasting experiences that are beneficial at all from that pursuit. If you went and had coffee with a friend for 20 minutes and you were super engaged in conversation with that person, and it was, a really in the moment now type of experience, that is better than, 10 hours of surfing online, because you leave from that with just this sense of quiet and calm. Plus your experience in the moment there is also so reinforcing that those are the kind of things we need to string together.
Right. Yeah, it is really interesting. I had numerous friends try to get me to download TikTok because they're like, you got to check it out. This algorithm is amazing. I'm like, I can just scroll for hours. I'm like, I am never touching this app ever, because of how great people tell me it is. To go back for a second, because you mentioned a couple of things about internet pornography, and it seemed like you had something, really beneficial that maybe we could share with some of the, I don't know if it's specifically towards men or towards women as well, and like the way it is harmful, and if there is a way for it to be beneficial, because you said some psychologists are recommending it, and why, if we can touch on that for a moment.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is not in the book. So if people are listening to this and hoping to find out, this isn't. This might be a book at some point, but it wasn't in here. But one of the probably the central things to know about pornography is, well, there's a few things, but it's not a sexual issue. So sometimes when people talk about they're a sex addict or addicted to pornography, what they're actually addicted to is the sensation that they get from being in that world. There's an escapist kind of quality to surfing that's very heavily rooted in evolution. That the male brain is geared towards novelty within sexual arenas. There's an effect that you can look up called the Coolidge effect. This has been widely studied in psychology, and it's actually a fairly old finding, but the Coolidge effect basically shows that males have this refractory period after they've had intercourse that they can't physically perform with that same partner immediately again. That's true for like 99% of males, that there's this refractory or this recovery period. But, and this is what the Coolidge effect says, if that male is introduced to a brand new novel partner, then that refractory period goes down to almost zero. So that shows us that the male brain is actually geared towards this type of novelty in partner, and not just to sex. Because if it's a sex addiction, then you'd presumably want to have sex with whoever it is over and over again, right? And so what the internet does, what the internet pornography does exceptionally well, is provide unlimited variety and novelty to the user, so that the user can then keep their levels, their neurochemical levels, and dopamine is one of the main neurochemicals involved, hold that dopamine level at an incredibly high level over extended, unnatural periods of time. And because of the variety and novelty, if the dopamine levels start to drop for that male, then they can immediately bump those levels back up again by changing the subject searches and go into something novel. So, initially it might just be sexuality or intercourse or partners looking, and then it's groups, and then it's all sorts of weird things you can get to because the internet allows that to happen.
Right.
So what males don't understand, number one, you learn nothing about relationships when you're doing that. You learn nothing about being a good sexual partner when you're doing that. In fact, you learn the opposite. Your brain learns that sex looks like this. Sex looks like this impersonal, pleasure-driven experience with unrealistic expectations about performance and so on like that. That by the time they actually try to have normal sexual relationships, their brain doesn't kick into gear on it. There's been this epidemic, especially within North America, around young people, 16 to 20-year-olds, going to the family doctor and saying, I can't get hard with my partner. And family doctors prescribing Viagra for young adults as a result of that.
What? Wow.
If you look that up, it's been reported across media in North America for years. There was actually a CTV, that's with the local news channels. There was a report in Halifax like 5 or 6 years ago about this phenomenon of 18-year-olds getting Viagra. Well, the reason is because by the age of 10, over 50% of young boys surf hardcore porn daily. So by the time these young boys are trying to have a normal relationship, maybe around 16, 17, they can't, because their brain understands sex to be something different. And it understands sex to be this coping experience, because what the boys and men teach their minds to view sex as is not as a sexual experience, but as a release experience, as an escape from the world experience.
Interesting. I just wrote down sex as coping. I've never heard that when talking about in pornography. That's really fascinating. So you're saying that because maybe at that age you maybe have a bit of ennui, your body's changing, you have all these things, high school, everything's new, and so to cope from that, you're looking at pornography as an escapism. And so how does that affect when those young boys are going out into the world, when they have to meet women? Like, if they're not in a negative mood, they don't want to get aroused, or what's the cause effect there?
Let me add another piece there, and let me tie it back to the book. Like, it was this line of thought around sexual offending, internet pornography, and so on that led me to the hack and evolution and general mental health work. Because as we've established here, our ancestors evolved in a time where everything was a survival threat. And so for our ancestors, being in a vigilant mindset 24 hours a day was crucial to survival. Like, they could not let their guard down. There was danger around every corner. There was the risk of starving to death. So constantly being on guard, looking for food sources. Like, there was this constant state of anxiety for our ancestors. Okay. You cannot have sex when you're in that mindset. Like, can you imagine having your life literally at risk and then thinking, hey, baby, what are you doing? You can't. Those are two different mindsets. So because, as I said, evolution required both survival and procreation, then evolution had to develop a system so that the male could switch and then actually have sex when they're in this mindset. So what it did was it developed this flooding of the brain with this dopamine. That's the neurochemical I mentioned before, which is a pleasure chemical. So the scenario I often say is, imagine our male ancestor walking through the woods when people were few and far between, right? So our ancestors walking through the woods in this total state of vigilance around survival, anxious and everything. And they come across an eligible female. So when that male visually sees an eligible female, the process of arousal starts, because arousal was an evolved mechanism. And the arousal is to flood that guy's brain with dopamine. When the brain gets flooded with dopamine, all negative worry, everything disappears. Common sense disappears. And males continue to experience that to this day. When a male's aroused, he thinks differently. He makes poor choices. And then when he's done, this is the other thing from evolution. When the male, so he escapes from anxiety, he has intercourse, and then at the moment of orgasm, that male brain, the dopamine washes out, and you go right back to vigilance mode, which makes total sense from our evolutionary perspective. And our males today continue to experience that at the moment of orgasm, thinking changes. Like, things that might have been arousing in the moment are now like, I don't know what I was doing about that. Like, questioning ourselves, like, Right. So that mechanism of having this dopamine and arousal paired and washing away all anxiety, that's the part that becomes addictive for men. And you can sustain that level of dopamine at such a high level for such a period of time that you don't realize that it's not sex that I'm after here. It's this dopamine hit. And that's why guys that have problems with internet porn oftentimes surf, for an hour at a time. If the internet porn was just used because your partner's not available and you're horny, that's a 5-minute session. If you're using it for something totally unrelated to sex, which is, my life sucks, I hate myself, I've got no friends, I want to escape into a world where nothing matters. That's the hour, sometimes 2-hour session. Wow. And they don't want those internet porn sessions to end, because when they end, they crash. And then now, not only do they think my life sucks, I have no friends, I have no girlfriend, I also just fucking surf porn for 2 hours. What a loser I am. Jesus Christ. I'm never going to do that again.
So it's essentially self-medicating.
It's entirely self-medicating. And so when health professionals talk about these issues as sexual, it really irks me because it's not sexual. We are misusing an evolutionary adaptation, which is to have that ability to procreate in times where we should not be in that mindset. That's what's happening. But unfortunately, it really distorts our thinking around what sex is for the males.
Right. That's fascinating. So I guess from everything you've said, the only way to frame it as using internet pornography as a net benefit would be if you're using it with your partner, if there's something productive or like, it's really interesting. Do you have other ways that you think it might be a net benefit?
So the terminology I use to talk about that issue is if porn is a means to an end, then maybe there's some room in there for it to be something helpful. But if it's an end in and of itself, in other words, I'm not using for something, I'm using it for the sake of being in that world, then it's not. I mean, a clear indication of when it's problematic is when the male goes to internet porn when they're not aroused or horny or anything. It's almost like a rote, reflexive kind of movement towards that.
Right. Like they're bored.
They're bored. I mean, that's
right.
It's very similar to some of the work done in addiction circles that people drink because they're angry, lonely, tired, bored, frustrated. And in a similar way too, like alcohol often is problematic, but there's ways to use it that it's not. But in the same way as alcohol and porn can be used for essentially non-problematic reasons, but it's a slippery slope because your brain is slowly learning, you know what? When I'm in this world, I really do escape all my troubles. There's something, I talk about this in a book a bit, a hypernormal stimulus. I think it's in the book. I can't remember now. But a hypernormal stimulus is something that normally would have a reaction to us from an evolutionary perspective, but that because of how we've manipulated in our modern world, it's more than what we ever should have experienced. So a common one of that is the way we eat. Food should not be as sugary and as salty as the way we experience it from manufactured food. Or fatty. It was fatty, exactly, because that's just not what we're used to from our system. So when our systems are built that when we discover a source of food that has those qualities, we do gorge on it from our ancestors' perspective because that's so rare. But nowadays, our systems are overreacting to those things because that shouldn't exist in nature. Just like in pornography, the ability to have unlimited variety and novelty shouldn't exist. Our brains aren't meant to handle that, which is why the dopamine levels go past normal and are held at that level for such long periods of time.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for touching on that. Even though it's not in the book, I think it's important for people to hear. Like even that self-medication or sexless coping, I'd never heard that before whatsoever. So I'm sure people find it valuable. But jumping back into anxiety, there's something I was hoping you might help me think about differently, because when I'm reading about either evolutionary psychology or even evolutionary biology on some level, sometimes I can get a bit frustrated because sometimes there appears to be a lot of conjecture and painting with quite a large brush over these millions of years that Homo sapiens have been around. And so I think, you and I would agree that general evolution is a safe bet at this point. But when it comes to the brain that seems more complex, it seems that there's a lot more unknown, or perhaps there's a whole bunch of unknown variables that we're still learning about. For example, like the theory, which seems sound, that we evolved to be highly attuned to all these threats that we've already discussed. And I think on some level, maybe the pandemic showed us that some people, even though they should be aware of viruses at this point, germ theory and our threats, they're either just willfully do not wish to acknowledge these threats and live their lives as is more convenient. So I'm wondering if you can help me think about more how these theories come together and maybe some of the gray area that might exist when thinking evolutionarily, since we obviously can't, quantum leap back to, 200 BC and see exactly how things were evolving.
Well, I think I would introduce here a concept I talk about in the book, psychological time versus clock time, which is something I stole from Eckhart Tolle, who's a spiritual teacher and lecturer, that he talks about the power of now. That's his big book, which I think is a fantastic book that really helps us understand how we spend most of our waking moments not living in the moment, that we're worrying about stuff that's happened in the past, or we're thinking about stuff that's happened in the future. Clock time. So just real briefly, clock time is when we're in the moment, like we're actually dealing with stuff that's right present now. Whereas psychological time is where we're not at all present in our current moment. We're thinking about the past, or we're worried about the future. So the COVID virus was an interesting one, that there are in the moment things we need to do, such as wearing the mask or taking some precautions around our travel outside and so on. But once you're done that stuff, the rest of it was psychological time. Worried about, well, what happens if I get it? What happens if I'm one of the worst cases and I end up in hospital? What if the hospitals are full when I get it? You know, that kind of anxiety oftentimes paralyzed people about their actions when it was not. I mean, it didn't help you prepare for anything. Once you've in clock time taken the necessary precautions that you should take, that as a concern should be dropped. Because continuing to ruminate and think, well, what else can I do, is not adaptive. I mean, it's, to some extent, there's an example I often use about if you get a blood test done and you're going to get the results back in a week, and you're super worried for whatever reason that your cholesterol is going to be high and you're going to be on, well, that outcome, let's assume that outcome's it's set. Like the blood test has happened, so we're going to find that out. It's either going to be positive or negative. If I worry about it for a week, that doesn't help me prepare. There's no clock time involved in worrying about that for a week. I'm not preparing for anything to worry about the blood test result. And if I don't worry about it for a week, that also doesn't help me prepare for it. But at least I don't have to waste all that time with worry for a week before I get the results. Now, when the results come, they're going to either say, yes, your cholesterol's high, and here's what you got to do. Back to clock time again. I have to take steps. Or it's going to say it's not high, in which case you carry on with your life, right? But we spend all this time in anticipation of what might happen when it actually provides us with no noticeable benefit to it. Right. So we do get into this situation with, like, COVID really brings it out in the open about worriers, you know, people who ruminate about it, and the people that almost in an anti kind of way say, I'm going to prove I'm not worried about it by not taking any precautions. Like, you know, I'm going to force myself to ignore it. So those people are not living in clock time, basically. They're trying to rebel against it with this approach. When we should all be on the same page about appreciating that there's steps. I mean, if you believe it, if we're moving past all the conspiracy theorists and the rest of it. But over and above that, there's things we can do for our lives. But then over and above that, the rumination and the constant catastrophizing, those are the things that undermine our efforts. Right.
Yeah, it's a great point, because I think there's so much psychologically that we could learn about the human species from this pandemic. Like, I think even if you take the clock time, to use your terminology, of the first maybe year and a half of the pandemic, like there were things that we were still learning. And so people were either saying it's nothing and they were just attaching themselves to that belief. There are people that are saying this is the plague and it's going to kill all of us. And there's people that are saying, like, we don't know yet. It doesn't look good, but let's sit back and let's try to take precautions, because I don't want to get something that we don't even know what it is yet. And it's really interesting, because I think a lot of those people that I think were saying, oh, it's fine, I think they were more on psychological time. Because they were like, I don't want to worry about this. I don't want to. And so I'm not even going to think about it. So I think it was their emotions driving their decision to ignore it.
Yeah. Although, if a person took the position of, I'm not going to worry about it in the early days of it, that might have been the right position to take. Because one of the things that I think has been very destructive for us as a species has been the expansion of telecommunications and travel. Because our ancestors 100,000 years ago didn't worry about a virus coming up in China. They just didn't know about it. And then when it eventually arrived, if it did, then they would have to deal with it then, right? I mean, there was 100,000 years ago, you couldn't stock up on supplies and the rest of things that might be a clock time experience.
Toilet paper, right?
But these days, we are inundated with social media feeds, news feeds, and news broadcasts, et cetera, that are all bad news. Like, it's interesting to me that news as a term is not positive or negative. And yet the slant that basically all broadcasters and media take is to broadcast the bad stuff, right? Because your brain is actually designed to absorb that stuff and worry about that stuff and try to problem solve it. So the more stuff we take in, and it's almost inevitable these days because of all the ways we can be subjected to that, the more your brain's going to take it in and worry about it. So the COVID stuff in the early days, that's another one of those examples that for the average person on the street, I mean, unless you went crazy stocking up on toilet paper, which I'm not sure that would have been much of a help either. But right. For the average person on the street, if we didn't find out about COVID until it was in our community, maybe that would have been better for our mental health.
Interesting. Yeah, because actually it segues nicely to another part of the book, of a question I had for you. So there's someone you use, what was the example of, I think Quincy, and you said someone who's always complaining about not being able to sleep, but they're staying up too late, they're playing video games, they're having alcohol and caffeine when they shouldn't be, and all of these things. I think all of us know someone like that in our lives, or we've become that person at some point or another. And so sleep is more, I think, nebulous, because obviously there's a lot of things built into sleep, if it's biological or other sort of stresses. But when you talk about news, and like if you just stop feeding your brain all of this anxious anxiety nonsense, and I think we can both agree that the 24-hour news cycle has created a whole new set of anxiety for everybody. So I can agree that, yeah, if you stop feeding nonstop, Twitter insults and snarkiness and the news nonstop, you're going to feel a bit better. And I'm wondering how you could help me see the other side. Whereas I think on some level it seems like you're promoting, I know you're not, but it seems like promoting almost like disassociation or ostrich syndrome at some point, where you're like, if it's bad news, then just pretend it's not there and you don't look at it and you'll feel better. And to go to the extreme side of that, like if you have someone that, like, again, the extreme side, like let's say Jews in the 30s, when they see something going on, if they're like, we should probably get the hell out of here because it looks like things are going to escalate and it's worse. And those are the ones that survived and, made it to other countries, etc. But if those were like, oh no, it's fine, this is just going to happen, these Nazis are fine, they just want to build up our country to be strong, they're the ones that maybe ended up in the camps. So the question is, where is the fine line between disassociation but only taking in helpful things?
So I think in some ways you've answered your own question, because so your brain is designed to assume every experience is probably going to turn out negative, and it's probably going to somehow undermine your survival prospects, right? And for most of us, we'll go through life and maybe we'll have a few of those experiences where that actually is the case. And so taking action does actually help us escape that survival threat, like this example you gave about the Jews being aware of that something's coming, right, and to escape. But that one instance of confirming that belief that the world is a dangerous place can mean that every other incident is treated the same way. Because right, how do we know when an incident that we're getting this bad feeling about, or that our emotions are telling us is a survival threat? Because there's people that live like that. They build bunkers, right? Right. So of course there's an industry. I mean, a good example of that in a real world perspective is the road rage thing. Can you get wiped out on the road by a bad driver and die? Absolutely. So should you then react with the extreme survival instinct and emotion every time someone drives badly near you? No, because that's road rage. But in some ways, maybe that's an adaptive thing. If the accident rate was, 95% of people that go on the road end up in some horrific accident, well, then you should take those precautions. Yeah. But if the accident rate in your community is like, less than 1% of people have a serious accident where they're injured, then does it make sense to treat every incident you see with that same degree of emotional negativity? No, it doesn't. But that's the trap, right? Is that we carry around this burden of negative emotional energy that affects how we see everything around us. So right, it is adaptive to live that way. Like, you will avoid a threat at some point if you live that way. But the hacking evolution part of my book, why I say hacking, is because your brain is built to assume everything is a survival threat. We have to remind ourselves that it is not. And that's how we're going to lower that negativity and be able to lead a calmer, more balanced life.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, because it seems like in most things, the key is trying to be able to parse through what is signal, what is noise. Like what is like, okay, this road rage, that guy cut me off, whatever, go on, instead of like letting the rest of your drive be consumed with that. And then on the other side, there's more like, okay, we live in a, whatever country, and either fascism is on the rise. There's a lot of things that we need to do as a society to band together. And if it just becomes too stressful, and some people are getting the advice, well, just stop listening to that stress, and it'll turn off. That's when you're like, well, no, this is a part in my life that I need to react, because this anxiety is something that I should listen to. Is that kind of what you're trying to say? That's
absolutely. And the other interesting psychological phenomenon to that is that your mind is built to take those single negative examples, especially when they're survival threatening, and to really hold on to them and remember them. Like a common problem we have in forensic psychology and in criminal justice world is that if you have one person released on parole and they commit a crime, then the public outcry is, so let's say someone's released on parole and they kill somebody. The public outcry about like, how did you let that monster out? Like, what the fuck is the matter with the system today that we let these guys back on the street? They should be locked up forever. Well, that doesn't take into consideration that there was probably 10,000 guys released on parole who did nothing. So the argument coming back, and it's not a satisfying one to the public, that, this is an anomaly. This doesn't normally happen. There's no way for us to know it. I mean, it's the same. I mean, I don't agree with the way guns are out of control in the US, but they oftentimes talk about how, why don't they do mental health checks, and why do they give guns to people and so on? Well, for every person that commits one of those, and unfortunately there's a ton of them in the States committing those kinds of mass shootings, there's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people getting guns who don't do anything. So there's no real way to parse out that signal from the noise about where is the one. So we can be worried about all of them. And we, like, for example, in forensic circles, we keep everybody locked up all the time. And then that would absolutely prevent someone from committing a crime on parole.
Right.
I mean, that's kind of what people are saying that should happen. But that doesn't really make sense from a resource perspective. And nor does it make sense from a statistical perspective that says, it's a rarity, it's an anomaly if that happens. So that's the problem that we come across, is that those single examples get stuck in our heads and are so easy to recall, and they shape what our perception is of how we should be acting, because the negative emotions get attached to it.
Right. Along the lines of like people being afraid to fly, but they're careless on the road when they're driving.
Yeah, exactly. Because you remember the big plane crashes. Like if 300 people die in a crash, that sticks with people for a long time. They think, well, flying is dangerous.
Sure.
But on that day that plane crashed, there was 50,000 other flights that landed safely?
Right. Yeah, I want to start to get into more quiet time, but with helping people of how to get the brain more quiet and try to help them with anxiety. And on the way there, I really loved the Rick and Morty example you used in the book. I laughed out loud because I'm a big fan of the show. And my brother years back bought me a poster with the quote on it. Nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody's going to die. Come watch TV.
Yeah.
And I really love that, because it kind of stills down like a lot of what you're saying in a bit of a obviously dismissive way almost, that like none of a lot of the things we worry about matter. So like Absolutely. If you stop listening to your mind kind of go crazy and monopolize your time and your life, you'd be able to just relax, go watch TV with a friend and hang out. Like I read today actually that 30 to 50% of people walking around don't even have an inner monologue. Like I'm still trying to process that that's a thing. Did you know that?
I haven't heard that. No.
Right. I need to fact check that, because I was talking to a couple of my friends after I read that, and my one friend's like, I cannot shut myself up. What do these people think? How do they think without these inner monologues? And so like maybe these are the ones that like we have more anxiety. I know my friend and I have a little bit more anxiety because our brain seems to be constantly on. So maybe you could touch on the example of Rick and Morty you gave in the book, and we can move on to quiet time.
Well, one of the things I'll say is that when you realize that the purpose of life is to those four pillars I talked about, the social and the busy and the creativity, novelty, and relationships, that if you're doing something within any one of those realms, that becomes the purpose of life. Like, I think it's interesting you talk about how there is no greater purpose in life. And I talk about that all the time. Like when you understand that we are a universe accident to be here, that there is no grand purpose. Like, I think people get so concerned about that. They have these existential crises, and that's kind of where religion comes from, is that there must be a greater purpose, there must be a creator so that I have meaning and purpose. Well, once you can kind of move past that to some extent, and actually there's some really good things from being involved in a religious or spiritual organization. So overall, there can be some very positive things from that fit those four pillars. But once you get past the idea of there's some greater purpose, then, and this is something that was a big experience for me about the quiet mind, then you can mindfully engage in some activities that ordinarily you would have said, oh, I can't do that. That's just a waste of time. Like for me, I started getting into doing puzzles. Okay. And I would spend, half hour, an hour in doing that. And sometimes I'd have like an audiobook on at the same time. And I'd find that just to be a very mindful activity that took me away from that constant chatter noise in your head about worrying about what should I do next, or problems or other things that really kind of contributed to your anxiety load. But it's stringing together those kinds of activities that a lot of times people feel there's a waste of time and I'm not accomplishing anything and whatever. But you have to appreciate that that's what your brain is looking for, is to be engaged somehow. So the more things that we can find that fill those gaps, the better off we're going to be as a result.
Okay. So it's more of our, I guess the more free time we have now, at least in the West, seems to be causing a lot of this anxiety. Because we're not engaged in things constantly as perhaps we were before.
And you talked about people walking around without any inner dialogue. I do find that hard to believe, because there's been lots of studies that show that people do have nonstop chatter. I talk in the book about a study at a UCLA about the wandering mind, they called it. Mm-hmm. And they found that people do have this phenomenon of uncontrollable thoughts constantly. Like, that's one of the big reasons why people can't get to sleep at night, is because they lie down in bed and immediately their brain is pinging around from topic to topic, and it's ordinarily getting stuck on something for them to worry about. But so this study out of UCLA found that it didn't matter whether the activity that you're engaged in was a happy activity or more of a menial thing like a job. The thing that determined whether or not you were content was whether or not you were engaged enough in that activity that your mind wasn't wandering. And because we find the wandering mind to be a very adversive experience. So if people can kind of walk down the street and have nothing in their head, they can be fully engaged in that moment. That's great. There are experiences that can create that. Have you ever heard of the term nature bathing?
Yeah.
I think that's become a huge phenomenon in the last number of years. This idea of getting out for a walk in nature actually has this calming effect on us. And I think it's in part because it's physical, but it also involves our senses, because there's the smell and the things that we can see on this trip. And it's being aware of your surroundings, because you can't just, as we often do on the sidewalk, or we see people doing with their phone in their hand, completely oblivious to the world around and walking down the sidewalk. In nature, you can't do that because you'll get a twig in the eye or you'll trip over a rock or something. So you have to be mindfully engaged in the activity of your hike through the woods, which takes away some of that element of the wandering mind. But then there's all these other aspects of that create this experience that, from an evolutionary perspective, really fits well with what we want to do. And I think that in those situations, I could understand that there's no inner dialogue. But in a lot of the rote situations where we're just, driving or walking, I think your mind does see that as a downtime period where it can now use the process of problem solving and catastrophizing that served us so well for 200,000 years.
Right. That's why I think it was such a shock to me to read that sort of stat. So I'll look into it more as well. Do you remember that Rick and Morty example you gave in the book enough to retell it?
I don't remember it, no, because I haven't gone through the book in a couple months.
Okay, because I hope I don't butcher it. So I think the one was, it was using the characters from the show more or less, that Rick is a bit of a catastrophizer. He's always preparing. He also always has some sort of gadget if someone from a different planet comes to attack him. His whole life is spent worrying about what could happen next. And Morty is just living his life, having a good time, doing whatever, like kind of he's more on clock time. And if I remember correctly, I believe what your point was, like, well, who's living the better life? And you're like, it doesn't matter. Like they're both living their own lives, having different levels of happiness and success. And I think along the lines is that, like, they're creating their own reality and and what their happiness level is. Is that more or less the gist?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, what I was kind of doing there is leading people down a bit of a trap to think, oh, well, if you live in clock time, that's way better. Like he's obviously has a better life, but we can't say that. Like we do have to acknowledge and appreciate that people choose their own paths. And so if they have the knowledge and the awareness of self to choose a path that helps create more quiet time for them, which I think should be a goal for most people, then how the path looks to get you to that point doesn't really matter that much.
Right. That's great. I really enjoy that. So how would you sum up quiet mind? Like if someone's trying to get their mind to be more quiet, like what are the elements that they could engage in to help them?
So quiet mind is the phenomenon of being fully present in your moment to the degree that the only thoughts and experiences you're having are related to that moment. I told you earlier that if a person went for a 20-minute coffee with a really close friend and they're catching up and they're just so engaged in that moment for that period of time, that to me is a classic example of quiet mind. That, but you know, the 20 minutes goes by and they think they've only just started, like it's been a minute. Like the experience of quiet mind is that you're so involved in your moment that you lose perspective on time and other things around you. Like that is an experience that a lot of us don't have on a regular basis, and that we should. And you can find it in those four things. So in relationships, you have those moments where you're, especially in newer relationships, where you lose track of time. You're just so interested in the other person and happy with the interactions that nothing else matters. People that regularly engage in exercise sometimes report that same kind of phenomenon, that when they get into a really good workout, that they're just so involved. They're aware of their own workout, their muscles, et cetera, that they lose track of other things around them. Those are great experiences to have. And the nature bathing, for example, or like I said, working on a puzzle, listening to an audiobook. There's lots of experiences that can give you that sensation of quiet mind, but it all boils down to being fully present in the now, as Eckhart Tolle would say, or being fully mindful. That's a big movement in psychology, is talking about mindfulness. That's essentially the experience of quiet mind. Okay,
that's great. I want to be respectful of your time. The last thing, I remember I really liked this book. It was just, I think it was at the beginning of the chapter, and it said, you don't need to think all the time. And it made me laugh out loud, because it really is such a simple thing that everyone knows, but no one knows. Because if your mind is on autopilot, and why meditation and yoga and all these things, not to mention drugs and alcohol, why all these things are so popular is because, like, we become a bit of a slave to our thoughts. Sam Harris, who talks about meditation on his podcast fairly often, is a big proponent of this, that, like, unless we learn to quiet our mind and to realize that we're not our thoughts, it's easy for them to just take us emotionally and drag us all over the place. So just reading that, I think a lot of people would really just help being told, like, you don't need to think about that right now or ever. It really is your choice on one level or another. And so I just would love to hear you talk about that tiny element.
I mean, it's a tagline I sometimes put on things, is think less, be more, because I think we do have this bias in society that, to be thoughtful and reflective and to think about things. Like this is, again, one of my pet peeves in mental health. So if you have a person who has anxiety and they ruminate and they worry about things and they come in for help, traditional mental health psychology treatment would be to get them to sit on the couch and to talk about it and talk about it. And what are you worried about? And why is that a worry? And I just, from my perspective, using evolution, that is the wrong approach. Like, what you should be doing is coaching that person around how to become actively, mindfully engaged in their world to the point where it blocks that stuff out. You can't work through that stuff by talking about it more. I think I have an example in the book about, if someone was choking, your idea to help them would not be to put more food in their mouth and see if you can shove it down. But that seems to be oftentimes what mental health's perspective is, that if someone has trouble with thinking too much, let's get them to think even more and work through it and talk about it. Right. I think that the route to us feeling better overall is to have less stuff to think about, because from the perspective of evolution, we developed within a very small area of the world. So let's say maybe 20 square kilometers is all that we could access in our lifetime. That didn't include trouble in the Middle East or war or viruses or, all sorts of stuff that now our world is the entire world. So we have so much stuff going on in our brains. So I would encourage people to take that social media, or especially a news holiday, because I did that early on, where I just stopped listening to the news on the morning commute. And that made a big difference because it's consistently the case that you will hear a story on the news that frustrates you. Like, politician getting away with something, or mismanagement of funds, or different things that you think, like, how can that go on? How come there's not repercussions? And then you dwell on it and you worry about it and you think about it. But you have no control over that. That's not your domain. So I think it's super important for us to understand that thinking less, having less mental activity, is not a sign of weakness. It's not a sign of not, living up to your potential. It actually might be the route to finding your own potential and to being fully engaged in your life in a meaningful kind of way that you just were missing out on before.
Right. I really love that. And you touched on something that I want to continue just if you have a couple more minutes.
Sure.
Because I would agree in so many cases that is likely to be the point, or if you can just engage in things that are, more fulfilling because you're not on psychological time, people will feel better. And there's a growing school of thought right now as well that we're creating all of these things in society to help us adjust to a sick system that we live in. And I wonder how we can kind of, again, draw that gray line between all the things in your book that are super helpful for people that do have ruminating thoughts that are completely unhelpful for them living their lives and unlocking their potential, as you said. But there's something in the fact that if we're looking at all this injustice in the world and in appropriation of funds, all these things, corrupt politicians, and if our answer is to just say that I can't control that, I'm going to ignore it, is there something to be said that maybe we should teach ourselves and our society to be able to take action? So more people that are outraged of injustice would perhaps run for office, so we wouldn't have only the sycophants, the ones that are taking power as governors or premiers, and depending on your country. I'm just curious where you think about that.
Yeah, I mean that's a giant question, right?
Right. Sure.
I mean, I have arguments with people about the state of our leadership, because I mean, there's so many issues about how the pathway towards leadership basically weeds out oftentimes people that have good intentions. Right. Because by the time you get to the level of actually having power, you've been so corrupted by the things you had to do to get there. And there's such a bureaucracy around leadership that, sometimes it's difficult to do things. So there's a lot of issues about that. Right. And in terms of our own, when I talk about sort of ignoring that there's problems and trying to live within your lane and think less, a lot of times people do argue about, but when you see injustice and when there's things around you that should be acted on, should you not act on them? Well, of course. But there's, from a lofty theoretical view, if more people just stayed in their own lane and did what's right and then we wouldn't necessarily have this wide corruption and difficulties around the world. So I don't even know where we should begin with intervention when we don't know what's real and what's not real. So we live in such a complicated world with the bureaucracy, the leadership, the misinformation, et cetera, that getting involved, I'm not even sure what getting involved means anymore. But I know what happens when we worry about it. It paralyzes us and creates anxiety disorders. Right.
So maybe now you've answered your own question, because maybe the idea is that instead of us worrying about it all the time, if you feel this welling of anxiety or emotion that something's wrong, maybe the answer is not more thought but action.
You know what? I'm thinking about an experience I had the other day where I was just walking around downtown Halifax, and I saw this, like, a key card lying on the sidewalk. And I picked it up, and it was obviously someone's work key card to get into their building, and it had their name on it. And so I looked this person up on Facebook, and I sent the person a message, and I said, "Hey, I found this on the street." And the person was just so thankful because someone had broken into his car on the street there and then scattered his stuff everywhere. And it was going to be a nightmare to get everything else back, but at least he had his work key card back. So I met him and gave it to him, and he tried to give me $10 or $20, whatever. And I said no, because what I liked about that experience was, it was clock time. It was in the moment. And I think I did the right thing, which is to return that. Because if I lost my wallet or something, I'd love it. Actually, I had the experience where my son lost his wallet about a year ago, and someone contacted him and said, "Hey, I found your wallet." Right. So there are opportunities for us to do the right things on small scales and maybe even larger scales within our communities, and then sometimes expanding beyond that. But it's this clock time phenomenon of when you have the opportunity to act and take the right steps, we should be doing that. And that will actually contribute to those 4 pillars I talked about evolution, about the connectedness and social and being active and learning and doing things, because that's a way that I think we can have an impact that doesn't create an increasing reservoir of negative energies.
Right. I love that. I think that's a great place to end. So thank you so much for joining me. I did really enjoy the book. It gave me some amazing different tools, and obviously it sparked some 3 pages of notes here. So I appreciate you writing the book.
Great. Thanks, Michael. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks. Take care.
Okay. You too.
So thanks for listening to No More, No Less. I appreciate the time you spent with me today. So please subscribe and rate the show if you enjoyed it. It'll help me create more amazing content and get that next little bit of validation that I so deeply crave. If you didn't enjoy it, well, that sucks. But to make sure, I think you should listen to my next 10 episodes and then decide. I mean, come on. Rome was not built in a day. I'm just getting warmed up here, guys. So thanks again. See you next time.